So Mark Canella, UVM Extension. I'm going to start a conversation about maple economics, maple business. Chris hopefully will join later today and talk a little bit more about this kind of forestry assessment, which is really this integration of the land and the natural resource with some business things. So I'm going to allude to some of those business things this afternoon with the hope that we'll probably spend a little more time, like between now and tomorrow, just kind of talking about it. And then I have some time on the agenda tomorrow, which will be a little more intentional to try to really synthesize some specifics on the business side. Little bit on my background. I know probably enough forestry to be dangerous and embarrassing to myself. I did have an undergraduate in biology with a kind of a forest ecology major in a liberal arts school. My first project was with Cornell Cooperative Extension on a sweet tree project up in Canton, New York, where we actually sampled a couple hundred trees, did sugar content, and then soon after realized the evolution of the RO may have made that work somewhat irrelevant. But from a college perspective, it was, what a great experience to be in the woods and to do that work. So I did a little bit of that work, and then I did work at an educational farm for 5 years, making maple syrup at a small scale, 700-800 taps, depending who was counting, and decided to study economics. So I'm kind of like a farm dream person that found his way into economics and small business. Kind of an odd path, and then the dangerous part about it is once I started talking about business and what's pretty much middle school mathematics, I realized there's a pretty good fit for this in the agricultural community. I haven't worked as much in the forestry community, so there's going to be some questions I'll ask in the next couple of days of you to kind of get familiar. But in the ag community, which is where I really cut my teeth on business consulting, it was like, hey, let's do some financial projections. Let's talk about costs. Let's talk about margin. Let's talk about livelihood. So we've taken some of that work that I did in the ag side and basically have been converting it into maple. So my hope over the next half hour is to kind of give you a little bit of a business and broad maple industry overview, kind of like really big picture, and then start funneling down towards some things that your potential clients or maple business owners now have to deal with on the business side. And I think what I'm hoping is that this kind of becomes a segue between this afternoon's just kind of casual conversations and tomorrow to then be like, where does this kind of meet? Where does your expertise in the natural resource and maybe your client services or your research meet with this kind of practical business and financial reality that the landowner or the maple operator is going to be either bound by or where they may be seeing opportunity. And so I guess I'm kind of hoping to kind of lay that up and then sort of see where this conversation goes. And that's kind of where I get excited, is that trying to find that middle ground. And I think there's value there. I hope there's value, especially as 30 or 40 people in this pipeline that are thinking about maple, to be able to have forestry professionals that can actually be able to have a really good sense of the property and the resource and not have to be experts on maple business and economics, but be able to kind of suss out the environmental side and a little bit about that human being that's on the idea side of it. And, ideally, be able to add some more value to their planning, which I think ideally adds some value to the forest planning as well. So I pretty much had that, some industry trends. We'll talk a little bit about production investments and startup steps, getting a little bit into some costs in the next half hour. I can always kind of talk about business models. Mikey we've been working together for 10 plus years, 15 years. We can talk about business models. Everyone's got a different way to slice it, right? Which is cool, which is entrepreneurial. But I think as programmers, we're always trying to figure out what are the profiles? What are the strategies that maybe could work for the most amount of people, that could be a little more replicable, and to be able to separate them from the really unique ones where we can say, hey, if you're the all-star business manager, you're going to make anything work. And I think there's a difference there between what's replicable and what really just takes that innovative business leader to kind of pull off. And I think tomorrow we'll get a little bit more into this forester maple business owner interaction, because I'm interested to learn from you all the idea, if some of you have experience with longstanding timber properties or the transition to maple use, the difference between an agricultural mindset or a business planning mindset for farming from maybe what I'm assuming is really long-term forest stewardship and the investment and kind of the economic returns that come from 20, 40, 50 years. How long are these forest management plans mapped out for? 20 years is probably short, right? Is 50 years out of the planning horizon, or is that like well within the planning horizon?
It depends on what you're talking about. For the current use program, it's every 10 years.
Yeah.
But for, a typical, maybe a town forest plan, it might be more like a 10 to 20 year time frame.
Okay.
But 50, I don't know about 50, but
Okay.
I haven't seen that.
But when you all, this was the first question, when you're all scanning a forest, if someone were to say, I'm thinking about maple, what's your planning horizon when you're looking at that resource? Are you thinking in 10-year increments because you're into that kind of planning?
The age of the landowner first.
Okay.
Seriously, you do.
There you go.
And if they talk about their kids or family that, they want to do something that's going to be inherited and taken over.
Yeah, so there you go. Age of the owner, possible generational transfer.
Mm-hmm.
And that'll flip us right back into this business planning world. Mike happens to be a specialist on succession, transfer planning, in family and non-family related transfers. Yeah. All right, let's dive in. Ask questions, please. Questions or comments. This is just a quick snippet from that assessment tool. So you've got it in your folders. You can zoom in and scan it. And I think Chris will do the best job, hopefully later today, going through. But I guess what I'll say is there's a combination of resource-based assessments and some business assessments in there. So as I'm talking today, I am just sort of mentally noting there are some things like rental rates. There are some questions about profitability that are definitely going to be relevant to potential forest owners or forest managers out there. So we're going to kind of dance around these bigger themes right now, knowing that some of these specifics are actually going to be held within that assessment tool. And my only comment on the assessment tool before Chris gets here is there's like a list of like 20 or 30 questions, which I love as sort of an individual that is meeting somebody, to be able to have enough questions in my toolbox to be interested in all the possibilities that they may be thinking about or wishing or feeling that are important, and then being able to start to funnel it down and being like, where can I go from being an open listener to I've got a technical skill set that I can add to this planning process, or I've got the key referral that's a specialist that I'm going to be able to hand my client or my participant to so that they can move forward with their planning. And I feel like that's the real value, is sort of starting really big, asking a bunch of questions, and then being able to do some of that kind of spot diagnosis to be like, let's figure out how to make the most out of their time. And then ideally, with business planning for me, I'm kind of like thinking, I'm not come up with anything super innovative sometimes, but if I can change their planning and failure process from 12 months of sorting it out to like 3 months of getting the right resource and the right call with the right person, that's real money for somebody. To move that thing forward 3 or 6 months to get it implemented before winter time, or to save them a year of some failure. So here's some trends. U.S. maple production over the past 20 years. The black line with the yellow dots is the maple production, gallons or pounds, gallons here on this scale. And you can see that it's variable, but look at the dramatic growth in 20 years. Statistics are not perfect, so the magnitudes may not be exactly right, but I think people are comfortable with the trends, knowing that maple production nationwide has grown dramatically, over doubled in 10 to 15 years. And then the blue bars are going to be the actual active taps in the U.S. So you can see the progressions of taps is a little more consistently up, and then the production, we're certainly dealing with some swings. Notable certified organic syrup production, I just drew in a line the best I could with what's available, and that's the green line. Estimating that over half, maybe up to 60% of national production in the U.S. is certified organic. I'm actually curious if that's going to change much on the forestry side. I know that there are maple standards for certified organic. Some of that will be in the sugar house with processing agents and just kind of food processing criteria. So I think this is a good question or a thought point back to you all on the resource base, the dynamic of who's organic, who's not organic. But we do know the markets right now they're growing. The buyers or the sellers will say that we're experiencing consistent maple market growth, but the growth rate is definitely higher in the organic sector right now. The organic product category is growing at a faster rate than just the non-organic maple syrup product category nationally. So these are some trends, and this is unique from agriculture. I think like when you look at milk markets or look at some other vegetable or a specialty crop, you may see something like 15 or below % of the national crop would be certified organic. This is really, maple is I think an anomaly here, where over half of the domestic production is actually certified organic. And it's kind of a head scratcher from a policy perspective on some of the projects I'm on right now, because the world is not really used to the majority of the crop being organic. It's considered usually like that small niche, and in this case, it's, I think, not. Going back, I'm referencing some survey work we did in 2019, a few hundred maple producers across the Northeast. Crop distribution, really important from my mindset. This pie chart is showing that 81% of the crop, so the pie chart is actually the crop. Hold on, I gotta get my head on this one. Is this the size classes? Yeah, the title may be a little deceiving here. So 81% of the crop is coming from producers that are 5,000 taps or more. 19% of the domestic crop, or from this survey, is coming from people 4,999 or less. The reason I'm gonna leave this up here is just if you invert that, the reality is this 81% of the crop is actually coming from 20% of the active participating businesses. So it's like a complete flip there. So 20% of the humans or 20% of the business entities are creating 80% of the crop. And they tend to be larger, over 5,000 taps. So there's thousands of maple producers out there, huge cultural representation, huge community kind of activity and like imagery. The volume of the production is coming from a really small group of larger producers, which is going to have impact when we start thinking about resource base and then business models and sort of knowing kind of where do these business models fit in the context of just scale and what's possible. So now we add that organic curve to the conversation. The larger producers all tend to be certified organic, generally because a lot of them are selling into bulk markets. They get an instant premium. Could be 15 to 25 cents per pound, depending on the year and the markets. So in this survey, if we slice and dice that pie, we'd see that the average tap count for organic producers is over 17,000 taps, or around 17,000 plus. The average tap of the conventional producers is around 2,000. I think the total average for this whole survey was somewhere around like 3,700 to 4,500 taps when you mixed everybody up. But if you do a split like that and say, well, who's the organic, you see this big jump. So now we're thinking about scale, and I'll let you kind of start to connect to the resource base and try to figure out like, how many acres. From our work with benchmarking, we've generally used like a 55 to 60 tap per acre metric as a way to say, okay, if I'm dealing with 10,000 taps, how many acres am I, what kind of zone am I in? From a parcel standpoint. A little bit of show and tell on some resources. The website may have been up on one of the earlier pages. I'm just looking to see, we'll see what's in your folder there. But we've got an active website with all these resources.
It's on the flyer.
On the flyer? Okay, yeah, www.maplemanager.org. And I brought extra copies of a lot of these that I'll show you up here. I bought like 2 or 3 copies. So when you got casual time, just feel free to grab one, put it back. But then go on the website if you want to download a PDF, or we can always do some distribution, I think, after the program too. There's a lot of documents, so I let you kind of pick and choose which ones are relevant. So we have done some startup investment profiles. Just as a quick, I've got a couple copies, but I just want to let you all know that we've done all these different scales from 3,000, 5,000, 7,000, 10,000, a very kind of like linear model. So once you read one and you read a second one, you're like, oh, it's all kind of lining up. That was the way it was done. We sourced a couple industry manufacturers and spec'd out a couple basic setups and got some average estimates on that. So I'm just going to tell you there's all these different samples, and I'll give you a couple of numbers just to get a sense of the magnitude of modern maple. Oh, that's going to be there. Okay, so this one is sap and processing, meaning we've got a sap production setup and a sugar house. I'm going to use the word processing. And these numbers are a few years old now, so you got to kind of discount, or you got to inflate, our inflation rates from 2020 through the last 18 months. So everything's going to be probably a little bit higher than this. But if you look at SAP and processing investments, we've got 5,000 tap over here on this column and 10,000 here. We've been running at around $52, $45, a little bit down on the bigger one from a modeling perspective, but $50 a tap is about what we think it's costs to do a setup for sap collection and syrup processing without including real estate. Right? So we just get our head around that one. Okay, so $52, 5,000 taps, you're over $250,000 investment right there. If you're going to add in the land acquisition with that, I put in a boilerplate $2,000 an acre. This is really going to depend, right? It's going to depend if it's a large parcel up in Caledonia County or if it's going to be a 40-acre chunk, somewhere in wherever. You're going to see all these different ranges. So if we were to take a $2,000 per acre, we're going to be adding $30+. You're looking at $87 per tap. That's just another nugget for you to put your head around as you're thinking 5,000 taps times $87. Where are we at here? We're looking at a $500,000 investment. And I think that's relevant. You're talking to people, they've got a vision, trying to figure out how much are they going to be able to put on the table themselves or access for credit to get a viable business going. Knowing that the dynamics of a maple business have its own, own cash flow and own kind of forecasting involved. 10,000 tap operation, you're getting close to $1 million. 800,000 on paper here. I'd always want to give things a 15-20% cushion up, especially operating costs the first year or two when things are getting started but not humming along. You've really got to have some cushion there. So just again, a very basic number. When you see 10,000 tap operation out there, at least $1 million wrapped up in this, at least. Okay, there's that $87. So if we were to look at SAP only, which is part of the emphasis of this project, is to be able to say, yeah, that whole idea of tree to table is cool, but we don't need to be limited by that whole vision for everyone out there. There's got to be access points for people that maybe just want to produce sap. And one of the reasons that Chris and I have been talking about this for a few years was hey, it's a lot easier or a lot cheaper to not buy all that stainless steel in your sugar house that gets used for what? 15 days a year, 20 days a year, theoretically, when you look at your run days and look at your sap storage. So what happens if we just look at sap only and we start to see the numbers shift dramatically from the operating perspective? Am I going to have some circles come up? Yeah. So instead of $55 or $50 per tap, we're going to be down to that $32, $34 per tap range just for the sap collection systems. It's still a lot of money, but it cuts a big chunk of the investment off. And this is a lot of scales. Again, all these reports can be accessible to you. But there's a big difference there between $55 a tap and $30. So I think that's, if anything, just to sort of open the eyes for people to say, you don't have to be a syrup producer to take this resource base and operationalize it into an industry that's growing like crazy. But there are other people that can brand that and package that and distribute that. If you've got the trees and the wherewithal and the interest, there's a business model here that's an opportunity to consider.
Question, Mark. Is any of this including an RO as part of that to reduce your
We
volume?
did not include an RO in the SAP only model. So we did include that in the processing models, but in the SAP only ones, we just held it at raw SAP. And we actually, I think, have got even we've got some SAP transportation in here, trailer with a tractor, and at some point, the big thing that throws it for the SAP only is once you have to buy a proper truck, that's one of the biggest costs per gallon of SAP is that transportation cost to get the vehicle. And thinking about harvest season, so I think the most creative people that have run really successful SAP operations, they've figured out the trucking logistics, right? They've either got access to lease or they have maybe a contracting business or access to towing vehicles that they can use for that period of the year. Because if you just throw a $65,000 truck investment into a small tap system, it really jacks up the price on a per unit basis. So no ROs in the SAP model. But the idea with these is they could be, that could be added in. If we get you to $32 a tap and you're like, okay, cool, we got to add an RO unit onto this, and then you got to add some power access and some other things at least you can start to stack it and build it up.
I would just say that that's part of the assessment tool is you can plug in that number. You know, the assessment tool and the cost of production is going to spit out like that break-even point. So depending on what you want to do, and if you're a producer that wants your own RO, like you can plug those numbers in and see where things shake out, or if you have access to one or something like that. So part of the live tool where you can plug in numbers is to answer those questions.
The RO might play a bigger role than, I guess,
If we were to add that into the SAP.
I think it's, in some cases, I think it's quite a bit more than a truck.
Yeah.
Because once you concentrate it down to 20%,
Much less on
your need of hauling large volume in the size of your truck
Goes down.
but you're investing a lot of money into one piece of equipment
Right.
with big power connections.
Right. New transformers, big power connections. Yeah. And I think let's just like chew on that one for a little bit. I think we haven't gone to that level again. So that would be the next step, is to be able to lay an RO onto something like this, add a certain volume of sap, and hopefully we got enough foresters in the room that could do some projections on what's potential sap flow, how much volume, how much sugar are we going to be harvesting, moving, and eventually selling. And then this really weird thing happens with something like transportation is, well, your sap volume is going to go down as it gets concentrated, right? But what's the lowest common denominator to a truck that's going to safely haul in the wintertime, right? Like, you can't necessarily take a $70,000 truck and incrementally move it to 50, 40, 30 and be like, oh, I only need a $15,000 truck now, right? There's a certain cost to entry for the vehicle. So that's what I would be really interested in, is try to figure out, like, someone who's really got boots on the ground and is thinking volume, tanks, flow, once per day, 2 per day, to be able to map out that, like, well, this is the lowest cost transportation we could feel comfortable with. You know, like, is there some balancing act there?
So, Mark, was the truck in that calculation or not?
Yeah, in the SAP. I think in the SAP. Well, let me go back and check the.
There's an extra 11 grand.
Yeah. And I think this is where we prorated. Yeah. So even this like analysis, we've got to sort of prorate a truck and tractor modification for SAP hauling. So the SAP ones do have it in there. Some of our sugar house models actually are like, don't include it because we've got an assumption of 10,000 taps right to the, the dreamy sugar house, bottom of the hill, like all that. And then we've got a couple that are like 7,000 taps, and then let's assume there's 3,000 that are satellite that need to be hauled back. So yeah, so we've got, hauling is in the SAP ones, but you'll see it's a prorate. Like it's an economic model. So we've sort of gone through the analysis of like, what do we need? And we've kind of done some depreciation calculations, because $25,000 isn't going to buy a heck of a truck, but sort of it's going to factor in the cost.
I think, well, another factor, I think I heard the NRCS is back to cost sharing on ROs. When I put the RO in my operation, which isn't a very large operation, it was $15,000 RO, and NRCS paid for 10 of that, and then they stopped funding ROs. But I heard this last year that they were back to funding, and our ROs at 75%, at least up to a certain threshold.
Okay.
But you can't do that with a truck. NRCS is a cost sharing.
Right. Has anybody else heard anything about ROs? Because I know the Vermont, Efficiency Vermont one, I think everyone's kind of rolling their eyes on that one because it was like a $2,000 or $3,000 credit, and it was only for first time. So it's everyone that's sort of like ready for second generation RO that needs an $80,000 unit is like $2,500, and I'm not even eligible. Like, so that one's kind of like over here.
We got quite a bit for ours, and we're getting more again for another one. And my dad does a lot of digging, and he never found anything about RO through the NRCS, but I've worked a lot with the NRCS, and they can be kind of hard to figure out their processes, so.
Well, I've been working with NRCS for 25 years, and their programs change what they will fund. Because I'm working with dairy and vegetable, and 1 year they'll be funding this, and then the next year they won't because somebody at the up in the management decided that it shouldn't be funding that sort of thing, and then it'll come back.
So when did it come back?
Well, I'm trying to remember who told me that they just applied for it in the last year.
Really?
So I haven't talked to anybody at NRCS
I'm gonna
directly.
fix that.
Yeah, we should find out. I mean, I think it's probably built into Equip. It may be a prescription in one of the bigger programs.
The silly thing about when I did it was through Equip, and then they had to pay for an energy audit first. I was like, come on, this is like somebody, your NRCS staff can do the calculations. This isn't rocket science, but they had to send somebody down to my sugaring operation and just look at the equipment and do some numbers. And then when they could show that there was an energy benefit, which I thought was a no-brainer, then they were willing to fund it at 75%. And so my understanding was and I'm trying to remember who told me this, because it was just in the last 6 months or year. That I heard somebody said that they were back, the NRCS was back to funding that again.
Okay. I think that'd be a great follow. I mean, I think the reality to all of this, whether it comes to technical services or even NRCS policy, like, let's remember over half of the syrup in the country gets made in Vermont. And sometimes it's a little scary to realize that, like, even the brain power in this room has probably got the potential to be like, let's figure out a way, let's make some calls. Like, we will end up leading the country. And same with forestry services. When I go to Ohio and Wisconsin, all sorts of great foresters out there. They don't have anywhere near the cultural familiarity with maple that we do here. And so it's kind of, it's always reminding me the impact that we can have. And if it's something like having enough people that can do those energy audits, I know that's been one of the quirks. That I don't know if there's a lot of TSPs. Is that still a term, TSP, technical service provider? I think there was a bottleneck there, and there may not be the right TSPs, because we're still trying to negotiate a TSP that can get up to Maine for some solar maple thing, and there's not that many, I guess, that are qualified or have the credentials to do the consulting analysis that NRCS needs to probably check off a box to release my taxpayer dollars, right? Like so there's a due diligence process that may be part of the RO. I'd love to follow up on it. I think that would be a huge, huge game changer as far as, seeing more public money flow into maple.
The energy audit has been an issue. I know for some maple producers in New York, they get that done through the EQIP program through NRCS.
Okay.
Were they getting cost shared on ROs?
Yeah.
Okay, so it is there.
Yeah. In New York, I don't think it ever left, but it could be.
Yeah. It may just be as simple as it's not an RO program, it's EQIP, and so someone's got to know to go in and be willing to go through that process to find the practice.
You think it's the federal government, the programs are the same throughout the country, but there's a state technical committee that makes decisions on what practices that each NRCS in each state will carry out. And then there's people in the administrative parts of it, they'll make decisions. Like at one point, the engineer for NRCS decided they weren't going to fund more than 2,000 feet of laneway for dairy farms for a few years, until they realized in the clay soils of Aston County, it wasn't going to work at 2,000 feet. And then they went back, and so, I understand like Vermont's the only state in New England where they don't cost share on deer exclusion fencing for vegetable farms, because the state technical committee or somebody higher up decided that. So it could be somebody, it might be available in New York all along, and then for some reason it disappeared in Vermont because somebody made a decision that they didn't want to fund that to stretch a budget somewhere.
My understanding is that if you have the treasure map to be able to show how the process works for their own organization and you lay it out, then you can get approved. I've heard people giving the step-by-step logic about why it could be approved, and then you get it. I don't remember what state that was in.
Okay.
Different farmers groups have sent farmers to be at the technical committee meetings to make sure that things still get funded. I don't think the maple sugar city includes.
They may be not there yet. And I know there's an economic handbook behind the scenes in each region that occasionally needs to be updated for those cost-benefit analysis. And again, I guess now we're getting to the inner workings of policy and accessing the federal treasury, which are valuable things to know. That's good motivation. All right, so I guess this is a preview of the conversation I want to be able to have tomorrow after you spend a little time with this group and thinking about this assessment. What I just showed you was some benchmarks for sort of investment, the stuff you need to get into the game. And what is, I'd say, vague for me as someone who's worked with producers that are active and we've done benchmarking financial analysis, and then we've done some modeling is, well, what actually has to happen when someone goes out on the land base and says like, hey, are the utilities suited? Do we have the right access points? Do we need to do some in-forest road construction? I know the best sugar makers will say the best thing for their labor efficiency and their payroll forecast is to build good roads immediately so people can access the woods efficiently. because it saves time in the long run. So these are the kind of things that I'd like you to be thinking about now. And then my hope is tomorrow to actually get to some specifics, because I'm guessing some people in the room actually know what transformers cost and may have some estimates in their head of, well, how many dollars per feet of this given this practice. Those are all things that I think are going to really be supportive to, I think, this group as a whole. And being able to, again, get people a little bit farther along than where they are, knowing that they're going to have to massage their numbers for their own situation, but at least give them a sense of like, is this a $500,000 type thing? Or is this a $2 million type thing? So that we can find that right match. A little bit on maple cost management from our work with active producers. Where are the costs? The two biggest costs, the labor, whether it's paid or unpaid. We love unpaid labor in the agricultural sector. We don't love unpaid labor when there's a family transition plan or succession plan, because then the younger generation's like, wait, I don't get paid for this? And depreciation. Those are the two biggest ones. Over 60% or about 60% of the annual expenses are generally caught up in the value of a human being putting time into the business, and the depreciation or the wear and tear, the degrading of the value of the investments over time. So we could talk all day about fuel usage, and we could talk all day about the price of glass bottles, which are certainly relevant on a cash flow perspective. But if we're looking for the biggest chunks, it's these two. And I think, again, over the next 2 days, some of you that are in forestry services, I think this is something that is a big consideration of running a syrup operation, right? This is a little different than a forest management plan with outside services that maybe come and harvest timber and somebody else that trucks it for the landowner. This is saying, hey, landowner or operator, you need to generate a lot of time on this business to get these maple trees well managed, to harvest the sap and to move it through in a quality process. So there's some costs. A little bit on sap here before I wrap up. So Chris did do a survey this past fall, specifically on sap buying and selling. And so some of the takeaways, starting with the pie chart. About 63% of the people surveyed just have no activity with sap buying or selling. So over half people are like, no, I'm harvesting my own sap, I'm making my own syrup, that's how I operate. But over 35% of people actually are involved. So from Baseball Hall of Fame standards, we're getting to that zone here. Almost a third of the population are either selling sap or buying sap. We know that people that have existing syrup brands that for whatever reason are not able to expand their land ownership or not able to expand their sap harvesting themselves are actively looking to procure sap. I've built my brand, I've built my markets, I've got accounts here and accounts there. It's in my interest to buy sap from other people so that I can keep selling more product. We also know that sap harvesting by itself makes sense for low investment participants. And I have worked with a few people in their younger years, late 20s, who have said to myself, they've said, it seems like before I set up the sugar house, I can actually get active harvesting sap. Maybe I can pay off this initial loan in like 4 or 5 years and then decide what I'm going to do. Because I'm not going to have all that snowballed investment on making syrup, and also not that 12 months of labor to try to sell that syrup. Just want to get that sap system going. That can certainly be done at a large scale and can be a lot more expensive. But again, by a per unit basis, there's an entry point there for someone who just wants to produce sap. So again, a little bit of advocacy here, but just try to get people's mindset shifted from it doesn't have to be tree to table. It can be, you can make a meaningful contribution to the whole supply chain here. So in that survey, the question was, are you able to take on more sap? And 63, so the two different kind of stats here. The first one was 63%, 2/3 of the people said, yeah, I can take on more sap. Definitely, I've got capacity. And then from those people, at least 2/3 of them said, I can do it without having to make any additional investment in what I've got. I've actually got the capacity here. I've got tank space, I've got the processing capacity, I've got the human power to add more sap into my business. So we just ran some quick numbers, and it's sort of like this interesting moment as the industry grows. Goes back to Chris and I talking like 4 or 5 years ago. And this isn't great if any of you are working for Leader or CDL and doing part-time equipment sales, right? But the idea is you could possibly increase the U.S. maple syrup production by 20 to 30% annually without actually having to build another sugar house, not have to put another evaporator in, but just by catalyzing harvestable sap to people that already have processing capacity. And so this is, again, another bit of like kind of a light stat and sort of advocacy, but just, again, eye-opening for people to say, like, this could have a dramatic change, right? 20% to 30% growth on U.S. maple production this year would be equivalent roughly to the 2002 domestic production in the U.S. The industry's growing, so we're kind of playing the stats a little bit here, but just an idea here, like, wow, we could be making a lot more syrup with the stuff we've already got in the sugar houses, but we would need to deploy the resources in the woods and the expertise to get people doing that. I think that's going to be it. Yeah, so tomorrow we'll talk a little bit more about forestry, forest owner dynamics, I think, in the context of how my ag planning is maybe going to be a little different for how maybe your clients and your landowners think about the economic outlook of a woods. We'll talk more about those forestry costs, and we've got some legal stuff as well, different things that will sort of make these business models, make them work.
Question mark, so does the market support 20 to 30% more syrup production? Is there any sort of research to say that?
You mean we can't just produce it and hope for produce the product, hope for stable prices and viability?
Hope all you want, but
Yeah.
you gotta sell it to make money.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's where I think some of this is in that SAP assessment. It gets back to that business model where some people really are comfortable saying, I just want to produce a raw product and put it into the marketplace and trust other people and trust the market. Other people are going to be more entrepreneurial and are going to try to find the highest value, probably incurring the highest cost as well to find that value, but trying to find that sweet spot, so to speak. Right now, the maple markets are certainly still a little volatile, I think, post-COVID. Generally, the distributors were saying dramatic growth during COVID because there was a huge shift to at-home food habits, which was a boon for maple. More maple gets consumed when you're making hot breakfast at home than the people that are shopping and eating habits outside with food service. So there was a little bit of a bumpy road there towards the end of COVID, but growth was up. And then I think that people will say that the maple markets are still growing at a certain rate, but that rate of growth, instead of being 8%, is maybe softening 6% and 4% as we're coming off of COVID. People are going back to their other routines, which isn't big breakfast, not working at home. So the market is still growing, but this is the question of, like, I think at what price? Because maple prices are always doing a little dance up and down as well. So the market may grow when the bulk syrup is selling at $2.15, $2.20 a pound. We do know that Quebec has just changed their price setting for the next 2 years, upwards of $320 Canadian dollars, which gets us around $2.35, $2.45 US dollars right now. So we got to assume that the buyers at the big scale, the big buyers nationally that were comfortable buying more and selling more at $2.20 syrup are now going to have to figure out if they can get margin at $2.40 or $2.45. So this is kind of where I'm at. It's like, and I think this is the dynamic of maple marketing is we'd like to see that price go up a little bit more for producers. And I don't think it's antagonistic, but I think the big sellers are realizing that if there's a big enough price jump and the domestic demand gets shocked by that, we could be doing the industry a disservice. So there's this delicate dance of that price tension between, can we incrementally see price increases that reflect cost of production for the producers, but not go so hard into a price increase that the accounts that have been fueling domestic demand growth are going to switch to substitute A, substitute B sugar. Because maple is an expensive sugar. Not quite as expensive as honey, I think, on a per pound basis. So that is the dance. We've got market growth, it's softening, and I don't think anyone in this room has the crystal ball to exactly know. But those are the variables that I think are at play.
When you talk about selling sap, are you including leases? Or are you talking about people harvesting their own sap and then selling it?
Gosh, that's a great question, because this is like a year ago. I got to look and see if we've actually got. No, because we did add the land ownership cost into that. Yeah. So we've got a bucket for the land ownership cost addition. I think the mindset was, can we sub out the land ownership cost and look at like a lease rate for that. Does that make sense? So if we're looking at 3,000 taps, we've got the cost of approximately, so I got 3,000 taps here in this one, and we spec'd out the cost for 54 acres. So that must be, is that about, 1,000 taps divided by 55 taps an acre. So we've got the additional cost for land ownership. I think the idea was maybe sub out. I was going to talk about rental rates tomorrow. I mean, people, you following Maple tap rates right now? Anybody over $2 a tap?
I think
Depends on where you are.
in Franklin County, some people are at $4 a tap.
Yeah.
Yeah. To me, that sounds like, I don't know if speculation's the right word, but if you actually amortized land ownership, if you could access it, I think you could access it for a lot cheaper than $4 a tap over a 7 or 10 year land loan, I think. I haven't done that one in a while. You get to around, when you get to around like 250, 270, I think you're starting to butt up against, man, better off paying debt on, buying it and making a payment. Generally, we're seeing the majority of Maple leases are somewhere between 50 and 99 cents or 99 cents and like $1.25. That's kind of consistently been like that.
I think Franklin County's an anomaly.
Yeah.
It's almost
I
more
think
like get the foot
in
in
this
the
county,
door.
I think 2 is more.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just like a function of how much is available.
Yeah, I think for sure.
How much
Right.
get your foot in the door, get your name on that lease, and then see if you can work out a deal where maybe you don't have to pay.
Yeah.
that
I think
crazy amount.
prices in Franklin County are driven up by a few really competitive
Yeah.
sap buyers.
Competing against each other.
And the numbers, sometimes if you write it, like, that doesn't make sense, what
Yeah.
some people are doing,
Yeah.
what I've seen. Because I was looking at leasing an existing sugar bush with a vacuum pump releaser, everything. And I talked to Chris Lindgren about it a lot, and it was looking like $3 a tap is what I could afford to pay. And much more than that, I would be better off just buying sap from somebody, you know what I mean, at competitive rates. It wouldn't, I would risk losing a lot of money in a bad year, paying much more than $3 a tap. So then how could you set up the sugar bush and pay $3 a tap and have to purchase all those things yourself?
Yeah.
So I think there's some people out there who are just super growth oriented and they don't necessarily care. They have enough money thrown, oh shit, I'll lease you $3 a tap, no problem, and they send their crew out there, but the numbers wouldn't maybe make so much sense in the end.
And there are leases now that are production based too, right? Content based rather than tap based.
Sometimes
I would hope so.
Well, I think
Something
something
less
there's an
for-
add-on too, there's like a base rate and then an addition.
Like if the bulk price went up or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing is, I mean, just like real estate, there's some weird things that can happen in pockets, like beyond, I mean, the market becomes its own little thing, like a vacation lakefront or something like that, where the prices are just out of hand, which I really think what Franklin County has become. And there's some competition, right? This like personal competition here, so I'm not pointing at you, Will, but I'm just saying you are aware of it, so.
I mean,
so
I get sucked in.
it can twist that number even
Yeah.
more. I think the median is probably around $1 or a little bit more statewide. But then it's like saying, what's the median house price in Vermont?
Yeah.
Are you talking looking out over the lake, or are you talking about, an area that isn't quite as scenic?
I think you also see with some of those big guys with the paying the $4, it's like we see a lot of other things in agriculture where they're not looking at just that sugar bush, but they're looking across their whole net, or across their whole sugar bush. So if they've got a sugar bush they own and they've got that paid off, and they're taking that 4 and they're dividing that 4 across all their taps. So they're saying, well, my net cost is 2 or less than 2 because the ones I own are the ones I get for free and the ones I get for $1. And then they say, I can make this work because this bush is worth it.
I couldn't help but do the numbers here. So if we pulled 54 acres, a little less than $2,000 a tap, a little over $105,000, 7%, 10-year loan, annual payments $15,000 a year on that loan. Right? So we got $15K. Let's not break out principal yet. So $15K on, was that on 3,000 taps. So is that $5 a tap? I can't do math with you people looking at me. Everyone's like staring at me. Hold on, I got another calculator. Yeah, 15. Yeah. 15. So 15,000. I just want to check. Thank you. Okay, so we're at $5. So we know right there we've got this like kind of like $5,000 or five. If we're over $5 tap, we're kind of in this weird space. And what I'd have to do is break out principal versus interest on that, because you're renting the capital and you're paying principal. So a portion of that is actually going in your back pocket as ownership. So I'd be inclined to take that $15,000 annualized, and it looks like the interest starts off at $630 a month, and I can't do that math. So take $300 off of that. So you probably you might still be worth it at higher taps. We'd have to look at that though. This is sort of the money game, right? You got cash available now for investment? Are you kind of one of those people? Are you playing long game and your equity is more important? Or are you so cash tight that it's just a matter of kind of getting by? And is it even available? So I would love to keep going because you asked something about kind of revenue-based leases, and I got a resource on that. We can talk about that tomorrow. I think we're going to ship on to Mark. But I think these are kind of like, those are the trends, right? Like we've got the maple trees in Vermont. Do we have land access for those? Maybe not. So I think maybe the next step, like I've been getting calls on right-of-ways. So questions about people saying, there's a good woods, but there's really no access point. What's the mechanism by which I can set up this enterprise and transport that sap across two property owners to get to a hauling site? So now we've got to get into some of those kind of conversations to operationalize the resource that's just not roadside, which means there's more opportunity there. Just takes a couple more tools to get there. So I think I'm going to stop and hand it off to Mark for a while.